Alright, SBI3U. This is Unit 4, Video 2. It's about the digestive system. We just talked about nutrition and nutrients and stuff like that, so this is a natural place to go for our second video. So jumping right into it, we're going to talk about the digestive system, the function of it, just basic function. We'll talk about how it interacts with other organ systems. That's going to take very little time. And then we're going to go organ by organ through the system, talk about what every organ in the system does. And finally, we're going to review carbs versus fats versus proteins and where they are processed in the system. So without further ado, let's get started here. So the digestive system. The purpose of the digestive system, the basic function here is to break down the food and to get the nutrients out. And those nutrients are going to go to our blood. So we want to get, the carrot muffin that you just ate, and we want to take that carrot muffin and we want to get all of the stuff in it, all of the carbs, the proteins, the fats, the nutrients, the little minerals and stuff, all of that has to get into your blood somehow. Which means that it has to get broken down into tiny, tiny, tiny pieces that can make it through the cell walls, through the cell membranes and into the blood. That is digestion. So if you look here, digestion is just the breakdown, and that's the keep in mind up here. Digestion is just the breakdown step. So we call it the digestive system, but really it's digestive and absorptive. It absorbs as well. So the digestion is just the breakdown, and then absorption is going to move those nutrients from the digestive system into the blood. An important thing. The other two steps here are ingestion and egestion. In for in, e for out. It's on the other side there. And that is the basic function of the digestive system. Here's a map of the digestive system. These are all of our digestive system organs, starting with the mouth, ending with the rectum. And it's one long tube. If you think about it, you've got an opening here, you've got an opening on the other side, and it's just one long tube the whole way. There's a few places where there's muscle, little rings of muscle that close off the tube so that things stay separate. But other than that, it's just one very, very long tube. And technically, medically speaking, this tube is open to the outside. So because things come in from the outside and they just stay through that tube, technically the digestive system is outside of us. And this is why it's so dangerous when you have some kind of rupture in that system, like your appendix bursts and out comes stuff that was originally outside, and it can go into the rest of your body and do all kinds of damage. Or, stomach ulcers, holes in the stomach and stuff. You can have the outside mixing with the inside. Typically speaking, the system wants to avoid that. We're going to talk about all of these different things. We're going to learn what the gallbladder does and stuff like that. So that's the basic function here. Things get digested through the first set all the way down to about halfway through the small intestine. And then in the second part of the small intestine and in the large intestine, things get absorbed. So remember that digestion is only the breakdown. Taking the important stuff and putting it into the blood, that's the job of the absorption part, which happens small intestine, large intestine. Okay. Moving on, interactions between systems, which is one of our main goals here, right? Interactions. The digestive system is where we get all of our nutrients, including all of the energy that we're going to use for the day. So every organ system needs the digestive system in order to, take that carrot muffin and turn it into glucose that we can then use to power our bodies and things like that. We'll break it down into glucose and then get it into the blood. But digestive system can't go anywhere without the circulatory system, right? It's adding these things to the blood. That has to take the blood, the circulatory system has to take those nutrients and bring them to the rest of the body in the blood. And the circulatory system can't do that without the respiratory system because it needs the oxygen. And the respiratory system can't do it without the muscular system because muscles move the lungs. And all of this is coordinated by the brain and the nervous system. So all of these systems kind of work together in harmony, but the food comes in with the digestive system, which is great. We like that. So let's start going organ by organ, and I'm going to pause for a sec and fix up my my stuff here. And we're back. So the mouth, right? The mouth is the point of ingestion. It's where things come in to the digestive system. Technically, the nose is also connected to the digestive system. You can, if you've ever accidentally snorted up some liquid when you're laughing or whatever, you know that the mouth and the nose are connected. But I wouldn't suggest trying to ingest through your nose. Probably not a great idea. And it's the start of digestion. There are two types of digestion that happen here. The first one is called physical digestion, and the mouth is the only site for physical digestion. Everything after the mouth is chemical digestion. So it's important for the mouth to be able to chop things up, and we have all these different types of teeth to do different bits of the chopping. So like these ones are very much like choppers. There's some rip and tear kind of teeth, and then back at the back there's the flat grinding teeth. We've got this big muscular tongue to move things around in there to make sure that it gets to all the different teeth and gets ripped up and shredded before it goes down our throats. So that's physical digestion. That's important to increase the surface area of the food so that the different enzymes and digestive juices can get all into the inside of the food. If you just swallow it whole, it'll take longer for it to eat away at it from the outside in instead of just being able to go all over the place. The teeth do a lot of the work. The tongue moves stuff around. Chewing is often, well, not often, but if you want to be really fancy, you can call it mastication, which is the act of ripping up food by using the teeth and the tongue, aka chewing. But there is some chemical breakdown that happens here too. In particular, the biggest, most important chemical breakdown happens using the saliva. So here's you're not missing anything behind me here, it's just the lady's face. These are showing the salivary glands. Salivary glands make saliva. A gland is something in the body that produces a molecule that will get used somewhere else in the body. So, sweat glands. Sweat glands are a type of gland, and your hormone glands are different types of glands too. The salivary glands are they produce saliva, and saliva contains these things called enzymes, and enzymes speed up chemical reactions in the body. The one that's really important in saliva is called amylase. Ase is the ending for enzymes, amylase. It breaks down carbs into monosaccharides. So this is what a carb looks like. It's a bunch of sugars all in a row, just all in a row. These are all sugars. This is starch. And the amylase comes in and just chops the individual pieces and turns it into glucose. So it helps chop it up so that other enzymes can work on it. You can actually test this yourself if you have a cracker, like a salt-free cracker. Just put the cracker on your tongue and let it sit there for a couple of seconds, and it'll start tasting sweet because the enzymes are breaking down the starch in the cracker. I guess you could also do it with maybe cornstarch. I've never tried it with cornstarch, but I do know it works with the cracker. I just don't have any crackers. There are three main salivary glands. There's the sublingual, which means under the tongue gland, and it's actually, kind of attached to the tongue. You might have felt this before when you yawn and a little bit of saliva squirts out. That's actually from the sublingual gland. The little duct sends out some saliva. There's the submandibular gland, which is under the jaw. Submandible means under the jaw. You can actually feel that gland if you feel under here. There's lymph nodes and glands under there, and they get swollen when you're sick. So often if you go to the doctor and you tell them that you're sick, they'll actually feel these glands under here for signs of infection because they get inflamed easily. And the last one is the parotid gland, which are on the sides, kind of in front of the ears here. They're covered by a layer of protective tissue, and they're very thin, so it's hard to tell, but they're attached to the roof of the mouth. It's the saliva from the roof of the mouth. It comes from the parotid gland. Now the saliva doesn't just have amylase in it, it also has mucus. This is why when you spit, it doesn't like drop out like water. It has that like long kind of tail. There's some mucus in there too. And that kind of surrounds the food and makes it easier to swallow, just kind of lubricates it on the way down. So that's the mouth and the salivary glands. We're going to move into swallowing, which involves our next two kind of organs. Some people don't consider them an organ, but I will. So I'm going to pause and update that. Okay, we're back. The next step is to swallow, and that is done by the pharynx and the esophagus. So the pharynx is the higher part, and the esophagus is the lower part. There's actually two different paths that the food can go. One leads to your stomach, one leads to your lungs. The pharynx leads to your stomach, the larynx leads to your lungs, and there's a helpful way to remember it. The larynx is the lungs, the pharynx is the food. So, larynx for lungs, pharynx for food. This is why sometimes you choke on, you swallow and people say, went down the wrong pipe. It literally went down the wrong pipe. There's two pipes here. There's a flap that kind of opens up when you take a breath and then flips back closed to cover the trachea. The larynx is in front. You can actually feel the protective cartilage in front of it here, your windpipe, and the pharynx is in behind. So that's how the tubes are oriented, and there's that flap that blocks it. The flap that blocks it. And if we watch this video here, this is a video of someone that's actually swallowing. Here's the larynx. That's the larynx for air there, and that's the voice box. But you see that the food went down the pharynx in behind. So you see that it's a very small. There's the food, and big gulp. Yeah. Pretty cool, and you can see the flap doing its job there. You can see the epiglottis, that flap opening and closing when they take a breath, and that's letting the air down into the larynx instead. All right, so we'll stop that, and we'll get, here it is from the front, but you don't need to see that. Actually, we might as well watch it. Here's a real-time swallow. You'll see just how fast this makes it to the stomach. See how it's slowly actually going along? Yeah. You can see the lungs breathing there. Very, very cool video. One more time. You see that that kind of slow pour. Here it is from the side. It comes down quickly, and then it slowly comes down after. I think after it gets past about here. Right there. See, now it starts to slow down from there. The process that makes it move is called peristalsis, and this is what it looks like. So this is kind of a gross video, but I love it. Ooh, nice music. So this is rings of smooth muscle in the esophagus that are contracting, and here comes a contractile ring. And so the esophagus is one long tube of muscle, and it squishes bit by bit, almost like squeezing out a tube of toothpaste, and it's like that, and then 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 that, and it opens up behind, and then there's a second one that starts going that, and then that, and then that, and then that, and it pushes the food along in this manner. Both of these videos will be in the description if you want to freak out your friends. That's peristalsis. This is unidirectional. You can swallow upside down if you've ever tried it. Just do a handstand and against the wall or something, and then take a swig from a water bottle. It'll still get to your stomach. It's very cool. So that's peristalsis. You need to know about the epiglottis. You need to know the difference between the pharynx and the larynx, and just remember larynx is lungs, pharynx is food. Now, between the esophagus and the stomach, there's one of those rings of muscle that blocks it off. So at the bottom of the esophagus and the start of the stomach, there's this thing called a sphincter. And a sphincter is just a ring of muscles that can close or open or close or open. This one stops the stomach acid from splashing back up into the esophagus because the esophagus doesn't have the same protections that the stomach does. It's also sometimes called the cardiac sphincter because if acid ends up coming up there, it feels like a burning sensation right where your heart normally is, because that's also where the esophagus empties out into the stomach, and that's what's called heartburn. The official name is acid reflux disease. So acid because it's stomach acid, reflux because it's coming up, reflux coming back up. And that happens when that sphincter opens up by accident for various reasons. Yeah, that's how you get heartburn, and it doesn't feel great. That's the first sphincter we're going to learn about. There's another sphincter down here at the outset of the stomach, at the outlet of the stomach. So this one stops food from coming back up and out. This one stops food from leaving the stomach until the food in the stomach is well digested, and then this thing will open and food can come out. So that's two sphincters already. One at the end of the esophagus, which is called the gastroesophageal sphincter. So from the stomach and esophagus, gastroesophageal sphincter. Sometimes it's called the cardiac sphincter. The other one is called the pyloric sphincter, which we're going to talk about after. It's also sometimes called the lower esophageal sphincter because it's at the bottom of the esophagus. We're going to get into the stomach next, so I am going to pause. And we're back off pause. We're going to talk about the stomach. The stomach is where protein stuff happens. A lot of the protein stuff happens in the stomach. The stomach acid and the gastric juices in general are made to digest proteins, and it will attack itself. The stomach has to try to stop from digesting itself at the same time that it is digesting the rest of the stuff. So some of the carbs have already been digested by the amylase, but the rest of it, all the fats and proteins and all the other stuff, end up in the stomach. So you kind of get this mix of new food and old food. You get a mix of gastric juices in there. You get a mix of all of the liquids that you've drank recently. It's kind of this weird slurry of food and gastric juice. And that has a name, and that's chyme. That's how you pronounce it, chyme. It's not chime, it's chyme. The chyme, if you've ever puked because you're sick or whatever, you've puked up chyme. That's what chyme looks like. A bit more liquidy, but yeah, that's basically what chyme looks like. The stomach's about 2 liters in size, but it can change size dramatically when it's empty or versus when it's full. I've definitely eaten more than 2 liters of food in one sitting, and that means the stomach can stretch and contract. And if you eat a lot of food often, your stomach will actually get bigger, and that's an issue sometimes. So what happens in the stomach? It's all chemical. Everything is chemical from now on. The stomach, as it stretches, because it's got muscles in its walls, and the muscles can feel the stretch of the stomach, kind of like your bladder can feel itself stretching and getting full. The stomach, when it stretches, can feel it. Except the fullness feeling that you get from your stomach isn't usually a physical feeling of fullness. It's actually a chemical signal. It's a hormone called ghrelin that gives the feeling of satiety, of being full. And this takes a little while. It takes about 20 minutes to start for the ghrelin to start acting. And so, this is why people say to take small bites and chew a lot and stuff like that to try to get that ghrelin signal through. It's also why people that eat a lot, people eat large quantities often, their stomach will stretch and get used to being stretched, and so it won't send that ghrelin signal as strongly when it's full of food. So people have to eat even more to get that feeling of fullness. It's one of the things that can lead to obesity, is just eating too much in one sitting. So that's ghrelin. Gastrin is a hormone, and the gastrin hormone tells the gastric cells to make gastric juice, which is the stuff in the stomach that's actually going to digest the food. This is the infamous stomach acid, hydrochloric acid. It's quite strong, a pH of about 2, but it also contains mucus, and mucus is good at protecting the proteins in the stomach, right? The proteins in the stomach from the stomach acid itself. So your stomach is constantly coated in mucus. That's why your puke is kind of slimy too. This gastrin, the gastric cells also release pepsin, and pepsin is an enzyme, and that enzyme breaks down proteins. Pepsin is a protein itself, so it's kind of neat that it's a protein that breaks down proteins. But they're not going to create enzyme. They're not going to create enzyme on demand. They want to store that enzyme, and they want to release it when the food shows up, so just so they're ready for quick digestion. But how do you store an enzyme that breaks down proteins? How does a cell store that safely? Well, they store it as a inactive form, which is called pepsinogen, meaning generates pepsin. And basically this pepsinogen is a harmless molecule, but when it hits the stomach acid, i.e. when it's released into the stomach, it gets activated, and now it becomes pepsin, and now it can digest the proteins in the stomach. So it stops pepsin from digesting the cells that are making the pepsin. And here's a picture of the stomach doing some other stuff. It's got those muscular walls, like I was saying before, and it'll actually use those muscular walls to kind of like massage the food and mix the juices and stuff like that. It'll actually contract in a peristaltic type way, where it kind of squeezes from this side to this side, trying to push the food through itself. And at the end, there's the sphincter. At the end, there's the pyloric sphincter. And if the pyloric sphincter is closed, the food just stays in the stomach and keeps on digesting. When it's been long enough, the pyloric sphincter will relax, and some food will come down through and start going into the small intestine. So that's that. One quick little medical note about ulcers. Ulcers are caused by a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. Helicobacter pylori. They're bacteria that have this enzyme that neutralizes stomach acid, so they can live in the stomach, and they find spots on the stomach to hang out on, to kind of attach themselves to, and then they just eat the food that you've been eating and get their nutrients right from the stomach. But where they attach themselves to the wall, if there's enough Helicobacter pylori there, it'll make kind of like a bacterial mat. And then mucus can't get to that area. So the stomach acid starts eating the stomach in that area. And you get a very painful thing called a stomach ulcer. They're open sores, they bleed. And so you end up with things that are in your stomach can now get into your bloodstream. They're very painful. You get blood in your poop and stuff like that. Just an awful thing all around. And there was a great scientific debate back in the day of whether this was actually caused by bacteria or whether it was just caused by eating the wrong things. And the guy that was on in the camp that said, "Oh, this is bacteria," to prove it, decided to drink an entire flask full of active Helicobacter pylori cultures, and he got really, really, really bad stomach ulcer. And then he gave himself antibiotics, and he cured himself of the stomach ulcer. And it was one of those great moments in medical science where the guy just self-experimented to prove a point. It's really kind of funny. So, yeah, I'll have a link to that story down in the description. As always, you'll be able to read about that guy. I forget his name now, but it's just a beautiful example of, well, here I'll just prove it by experiment. We're going to move into the intestines next, so I'm going to have to pause, and I'll be back in 2 seconds. Okay, we're back, and we are talking about the small intestine now. The small intestine is where most of the absorption happens, but there's still some digestion to do, because we've talked about carbs and we've talked about proteins, but you can imagine that just chewing and having your amylase work up here isn't going to do too much on the carb front. We still need to finish dealing with the carbs. We also have to finish dealing with the proteins, and we haven't even talked about fat yet. So we still have to deal with all of the fat that we eat. This happens in the small intestine. So the end of digestion happens in the small intestine, and the start of absorption happens in the small intestine. And there are three divisions. There are three distinct divisions between inside the small intestine. But it's a very gradual kind of progression from the end of digestion to the start of absorption. From the end of digestion to the start of absorption. The duodenum is the start of it. It's the first section. It's got thicker walls than the rest because the food just came from the stomach, so there's still gastric juices to deal with. Then those walls get thinner as you get into the jejunum, and in the ileum the walls are very thin so that those nutrients can get pulled out of the intestine and into the blood. So that's the duodenum, jejunum, and the ileum. This is really dumb, but the way that I remember the order is DJI, the company that makes those drones. So I'm going to pause for a second and get a picture of that. You know, this thing, the DJI Phantom, that drone. You know, that's the picture. DJI drones. DJI. Yeah, I don't know why. That just stuck in my head. Yeah, DGI. Duodenum for digestion, and then the rest of them don't really match. But duodenum, digestion, you're still digesting. The outlet of the small intestine is not a sphincter. It just kind of ploops out into the large intestine. But the start of it does have a sphincter, and it's called the pyloric sphincter. The chyme comes through there. And then the environment has to change so that it's good to digest fats. Fats are more easily digested in a basic environment. So the environment has to change from acidic to digest the proteins to basic to digest the fats. And that's all done with the liver and the gallbladder and the pancreas. So let's talk about the pancreas first. The pancreas makes most of these digestive enzymes. It secretes most of those digestive enzymes. And here's kind of a cool picture of the connections between them. Here's the stomach. There's the start of the small intestine, the duodenum. So the sphincter would be around here. And the liver is up here. The pancreas is here, and the gallbladder is here. So you can see that they all kind of feed in through the same tube to the small intestine, to the duodenum. And some of the enzymes that it makes are amylase, the same enzyme that's in our saliva to break down sugar, break down carbs and starches. It also creates protease. It's not protease, it's protease, which is an enzyme that digests proteins, kind of like in the stomach, but it works at a different pH level. And it also secretes lipase, which breaks up fats from the pancreas, the lipase. It also controls the pH. So it controls, takes it from acidic to basic so that the fats can get broken up better and other things can get broken up better. Chyme comes in at pH 2.5. This activates secretin. Secretin tells the liver to make bile and the pancreas to make fats and proteins, to make enzymes that digest fats and proteins. Bile from the liver also helps break down the fats. Bile kind of physically breaks up the fats. It's a chemical sense, but it's like using salts, using electric charges to break up the fats into smaller pieces. And then the enzymes actually digest the fats. Secretin also makes the pancreas release bicarbonate, and that changes the pH. Like we said earlier, the pancreas controls the pH. This is done through bicarbonate ions, the same kind of stuff that's in baking soda. So your pancreas basically puts baking soda into the duodenum to reduce the acidity, to increase the pH. This protects the small intestine because the small intestine needs to absorb, so it can't have that mucus layer interfering with absorbance, interfering with absorption. Now, this increase in pH makes pepsin not work anymore. Pepsin only works at acidic pH, but the pancreas releases this stuff called trypsin. That's what we just called protease. It's actually called trypsin, and that breaks down protein as well. And again, it's released as something called trypsinogen because the pancreas doesn't want to store something that'll eat it. So it releases a harmless thing called trypsinogen, which gets activated to trypsin. And that's the liver. That's the pancreas. The liver produces bile, which breaks down big fat blobs into smaller fat blobs. And then those small blobs can get attacked by the lipases. So bile breaks up the fat. Lipases actually chemically break down the fat. And then when the liver produces bile, it's just constantly producing bile. The liver is constantly producing bile. And they store that in the gallbladder. So the bile from the liver gets stored in the gallbladder. And on command, the gallbladder is the thing that's actually going to release that bile. But it doesn't actually make anything. The gallbladder doesn't make any bile. It's just a sac to store the bile. And then that bile ends up going into the small intestine. By the way, bile is the reason that your poop is brown. The bile itself is what lends the color to the poop, which is always interesting to hear. That's the liver and the gallbladder. Talk about absorption in the small intestine. This happens in the jejunum and the ileum. All of these things that we've been breaking down proteins, which are done in the stomach and the small intestine by pepsin in the stomach and trypsin in the small intestine. Carbs, amylase, in the mouth and in the small intestine. Lipids, which is the bile, and then the lipase acts on lipids in the small intestine. Then various minerals and vitamins and water, they're all absorbed into the bloodstream. This is either done through active or passive transport. And it needs lots of surface area to do it. It needs to absorb a lot of this. It needs a lot of surface area to absorb, and it needs to absorb it through a wall. So what you need is you want a wall with a lot of surface area. So this is something without a lot of surface area. You can only absorb on the outside. If you spread it out, you can absorb all around the inside of the surface area. So that's the idea there. These are called villi, which are like fingers, and then microvilli are like fingers on the fingers. So here's a picture of this, right? Here's the intestine wall. One of these is called a villus, and on the villus itself, there are tiny, tiny, tiny fingers. And each of those provide a place for it to go into the blood, for the nutrients to go into the blood. So that's the structure. It's like I have fingers, and then if my fingers had other fingers on them. It's pretty cool. Sometimes I think of it as like one of those Swiffer dusters, like a duster. You have a bunch of surface area that traps lots and lots of dust, kind of thing. You're trying to trap food particles and get them to go into the blood here. One of the diseases that affects the small intestine is the Crohn's disease. It's the immune system attacking the small intestine. This is a normal intestine. This is a Crohn's disease intestine. It's all like inflamed, and it has, basically almost like pimples, kind of. And that means that this nice villi and microvilli thing gets interrupted. And there's a video I'll link down to below. So a little bit about transport. Passive transport doesn't use energy, so either just straight diffusion or some kind of channel, but a channel that doesn't take energy. And these require a concentration gradient. They need more on the outside than on the inside. This is usually okay in the small intestine because the blood is always taking away the nutrients, and the intestine is always bringing in new nutrients. So it's always kind of getting swept away. But if it's something that they really, really want, if it's a very important molecule like sugar, for example, it'll use active transport, and that means that the cells are actually using energy to grab it and pull it into the blood. This can work from low to high concentration. So this is only used for really, really important molecules like sugar and amino acids to build proteins and stuff like that. So sometimes your intestines are actually using energy to pull in the nutrients. Yeah, takes energy. Last thing is the large intestine. So I'm just gonna fix this up. Large intestine. And up here, we're absorbing mostly water at this point. Right, large intestine. It's the final spot for absorption. There's 4 general parts. The cecum is right where it empties. The colon is the very long part. Then there's the rectum, which is where the poop is kind of stored, and then the anus is where it's actually released. So the difference between the colon, the rectum, and the anus is colon's the big tube, rectum is the kind of poop storage area, anus is the actual hole. So you can see that here. There's the cecum, it's very small. The colon is the long tube. It has 3 parts, ascending, transverse, descending. Then there's the sigmoid, which just looks like an S. The rectum is, final poop storage, and then anus will actually release that poop. Some different things are absorbed, but it's mostly water, and some various vitamins and some salt that comes with the water. And then the rest of it is just flushed out. So cellulose is one of those things. Remember, fiber, it helps us be more regular with our poops. That just gathers things up and out it goes. All right, and that's egestion. Most of the water is gone. So it's solid. It's called feces. If it absorbs too much water, if the poop is in there for too long, if the feces is in there for too long, it'll absorb too much water, so you get constipation. Diarrhea happens when it's trying to go through very quickly. This especially happens when you're sick. If you've ever wondered why you get diarrhea when you're sick, it's your body trying to flush out, push things through the large intestine as fast as possible. So there's no time for that water to get absorbed. And there's smooth muscles that control the movement of feces. The internal anal sphincter, there's 2 sphincters, so 2 little rings, and they're kind of inside each other. They're kind of like that, like inside each other. This one and this one. The outside one controls the movement of the feces into the rectum, so it slowly brings the feces into the rectum. And then the external one is voluntary, so that's the one that we can actually hold shut ourselves or let go ourselves, and that's how we poop. And that's the end. So reviewing, we went organ by organ, and that's the entire digestive system. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys in class.